Sherlock Holmes and the Adventure of the Widow's Cipher, from the reminiscences of John H. Watson, M.D., by Arthur Conan Doyle, in style. Chapter 1, The Mysterious Widow. It was a gray morning in early October when I received an unexpected visitor. The fog had rolled in from the Thames, shrouding Baker Street in its typical London veil. I was seated at the breakfast table, quietly reading the newspaper, when Mrs. Hudson, our ever-efficient landlady, ushered in a woman whose presence was striking, yet understated. She was tall, dignified, and impeccably dressed in the somber black of a widow. Her pale face was framed by the soft curls of dark hair, her eyes betraying a grief that ran deep but had yet to find full expression. "Dr. Watson, Mr. Holmes," Mrs. Hudson said with a concerned look in her eyes. "This is Mrs. Clara Pembroke. She's come to see you about a matter most urgent." Holmes, as always, sat with an air of quiet detachment, his piercing eyes assessing our visitor with their usual thoroughness. He set his violin aside, his long fingers still lightly resting on the strings, as though he were considering whether the case would be as intricate as a musical composition. His sharp intellect quickly focused, not on the widow's mourning attire, but on the faint quiver in her posture, the subtle clench of her hands, and the manner in which she seemed to try and suppress the tremble in her voice. "Please do sit, Mrs. Pembroke," Holmes said, his voice calm yet inviting. "We are most honored by your visit. I assume you have come to us for a reason that weighs heavily upon you." The widow hesitated for a moment before taking a seat opposite us. Her hands were folded tightly in her lap, the wedding ring on her finger a stark reminder of the life she had lost only weeks before. Her lips parted, as though searching for the right words, before she began, her voice quivering but controlled. "My husband, Sir Edward Pembroke, passed away last month," she began, her eyes lowering to her hands. He was a retired diplomat, a man of influence in foreign affairs, and in the final weeks of his life, he spoke of secrets too dangerous to reveal, he said. I never understood what he meant. It was only after his death, when I went through his personal papers, that I discovered something extraordinary. Holmes's brow furrowed slightly, the wheels of his mind already turning. I leaned forward, intrigued by this unexpected twist. "What did you find, Mrs. Pembroke?" I asked. Her gaze met mine, and for the first time there was a flicker of fear in her eyes. "I found his will," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "It was a forgery." Holmes raised an eyebrow, his interest now fully piqued. "A forgery? You mean to say the document that declared the inheritance and your rights over your husband's estate was not valid?" "No," she replied, her voice quivering. It was an entirely different will than the one he had shown me months before his passing. That will, the genuine one, was nowhere to be found. This new will, this one I discovered, was full of discrepancies. It claimed he had made vast financial donations to foreign governments, and that I was to receive only a meager portion of his wealth, with the rest going to certain individuals I do not recognize. Holmes leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepling in thought. And this forged will, did it have any markings or clues as to its origin? Mrs. Pembroke nodded. Yes, there were strange symbols in the margins, little notes that I could not decipher. Some were written in the margins of books in Sir Edward's personal library, others in his private journals. It seemed to me like a cipher, but I couldn't make sense of it. My husband was a brilliant man, Mr. Holmes, but he was also secretive. I fear there is something far more sinister at play here. Holmes nodded, his gaze sharpening as he absorbed the information. You said your husband spoke of secrets, of things too dangerous to reveal. Do you think these secrets are linked to this forged will? I do, she answered, her voice now steady with conviction. I believe this will was part of something much larger, something connected to his diplomatic work, perhaps even his time abroad. My husband's career was not without its shadowy dealings. There were men he worked with who were not always above reproach, but I never knew the full extent. And now, after his death, it seems as though someone is trying to erase his legacy, and mine. Holmes rose from his chair, his tall figure looming over the room as he paced to the fireplace. This case grows more complex with each passing moment, Watson. Forged wills, cryptic ciphers, and a family caught in the wake of a powerful secret. Mrs. Pembroke, I believe we have much to investigate. Tell me more about your husband's library. You mentioned the cipher was found in the margins of books. Are these books still in your possession? The widow nodded. Yes, they are. Most of them were left undisturbed in the study, just as my husband had left them. It is there I found the symbols. But Mr. Holmes, I must warn you, some of those books are old, and some of the things I found were troubling. Troubling how? Holmes inquired, his attention fully fixed on her. She hesitated for a moment, her eyes flicking to the side. One of the books was a journal of his dealings with the government. There were names, coded messages, and references to events I do not fully understand. I found a letter, unsigned, suggesting that he had been involved in something that could ruin his reputation if it were ever made public. Holmes's face remained impassive, but I could see the flicker of intrigue in his eyes. He turned back to Mrs. Pembroke. "Where is this book now?" "It is in my study," she said. "I was hoping that perhaps with your expertise, you might be able to decipher the code and understand what my husband was trying to tell me before he died." Holmes stood motionless for a moment, deep in thought. His next words were deliberate. "I will need to see the book and all of the relevant papers. The cipher you speak of, Mrs. Pembroke, will not be easy to crack, but I believe it will lead us to the truth of your husband's final days and to the secret that may have cost him his life." Mrs. Pembroke stood as well, Harsiez, her eyes brimming with both relief and trepidation. "Thank you, Mr. Holmes. I knew I could turn to you." Holmes gave a slight nod. "Of course. We shall begin at once. Watson, gather your coat. We are going to Mrs. Pembroke's residence." As we made our way out of the flat and into the fog-choked streets of London, I could not help but feel that we were about to uncover something much more dangerous than a mere forgery. The widow's story, now tangled with references to espionage, foreign governments, and cryptic symbols, promised to be one of the most intriguing and perilous cases Holmes had ever undertaken. The journey to Mrs. Pembroke's residence was quick, but I could sense a growing sense of urgency in Holmes. We arrived at the widow's imposing townhouse, its exterior shadowed by the dense fog that clung to every corner of the city. Inside, we were led to a quiet study, where a fire crackled softly in the hearth. A large mahogany desk sat in the center of the room, its surface cluttered with papers, books, and the very journal that Mrs. Pembroke had mentioned. Holmes wasted no time. He immediately went to the desk, his eyes scanning the contents before he picked up the journal with careful hands. "This is the one," he said, turning to Mrs. Pembroke. "I shall begin with this." I moved to the nearby armchair as Holmes sat down at the desk, his mind already working through the puzzle. "You're certain this is the book, Mrs. Pembroke?" "Yes," she replied. "That is the one he kept most of his life, his personal journal, detailing his diplomatic missions, his meetings, and the people he encountered. It's all in there." Holmes opened the book and began flipping through the pages, his brow furrowing with each new entry. He paused as he came to a set of symbols written in the margins, symbols that appeared no more than random scribbles at first glance. But to Holmes's trained eye, they were far more than that. "Well, Watson, it seems our work has only just begun," Holmes said with a rare, excited glint in his eye. "A cipher, cryptic messages, and a web of intrigue that stretches across borders. This will be a case to remember, I am certain of it." I nodded, my curiosity piqued. Holmes had found something, and I knew from experience that once he set his mind to unraveling a mystery, nothing could stand in his way. What secrets lay within these pages, and what danger had led the widow to seek his help? I had no doubt that the answers would lead us into a web of espionage, scandal, and perhaps even death. But for now, I could only wait as Holmes began to decipher the cipher that would change everything. Chapter 2. The Cipher's Whisper. The study was quiet, save for the soft crackle of the fire and the gentle rustle of Holmes's movements as he worked through the journal. Mrs. Pembroke had taken a seat by the window, her face a picture of quiet anguish, while I remained standing near the desk, observing Holmes's every action. He was absorbed in the task before him. His usually impassive face now contorted with the intense concentration that came only when he was faced with a particularly difficult puzzle. "The symbols are deliberate," Holmes muttered, his voice low but clear, "and there is a certain cadence to them. Not random at all. A code, yes, but of an unusual sort, not one I am familiar with." He flipped through more pages of the journal, his fingers tracing the strange markings in the margins. Some were simple geometric shapes, others were letters seemingly written in haste, and a few even appeared to be foreign characters entirely. It was immediately apparent that Sir Edward Pembroke had been meticulous in his annotations, leaving behind a trail of breadcrumbs, cryptic but purposeful, that now seemed to point toward something much darker than mere diplomatic dealings. I approached the desk and peered over Holmes's shoulder at the markings, trying to make sense of them, but the combination of symbols, numbers, and letters seemed entirely foreign to me. Do you think the code is based on a language or perhaps a cipher used in intelligence work? I asked, my curiosity growing by the minute. Holmes didn't immediately respond. Instead, he leaned back slightly, his brow furrowing in thought as he studied the page in front of him. It could very well be, Watson. The symbols seem to be linked to one another in a specific pattern, not unlike a cipher I've encountered in the past, but with a twist. It's as if the key is hidden within the text itself, a secret waiting to be unearthed. Mrs. Pembroke, who had been quietly watching from the side, stood and approached the desk. Mr. Holmes, is there anything I can do to help? I want to understand what my husband was involved in. I fear the worst, but I cannot remain in the dark any longer. Holmes looked up at her, his sharp gaze softening for a moment. You have already helped, Mrs. Pembroke, more than you realize. This journal is our starting point, and your husband's final thoughts will guide us. But it will take time. Ciphers such as these are not easily broken. We must find a pattern, a key, something that links these symbols to something tangible. Mrs. Pembroke nodded solemnly, but her anxiety was palpable. I can't help but feel that there's something in this house, something that's being kept from me. My husband was a man of principle, but I always sensed there were parts of his life he kept hidden from me. Do you think he was involved in something dangerous, Mr. Holmes? Holmes took a moment before answering, his fingers lightly tapping against the journal's worn leather cover. Dangerous. Yes, Mrs. Pembroke. But what exactly that danger was, I cannot say yet. What I can tell you is that your husband's work was not solely diplomatic. He was involved in something more intricate, more clandestine. These symbols. He gestured to the markings in the margins. They are a clue to something deeper, something entwined with international affairs and, perhaps, matters of great consequence to the British government. I could see the tremor in Mrs. Pembroke's hands as she grasped the edge of the desk for support. What does that mean for me, Mr. Holmes? Am I in danger? Holmes glanced up at her, his expression inscrutable. It is too soon to say, but I will not have you threatened, Mrs. Pembroke. I assure you, my investigation will reveal the truth. All we must do now is proceed carefully, but first I will need to examine the other materials your husband left behind. I've kept them in the drawer, Mrs. Pembroke said, her voice trembling. She opened a nearby cabinet and retrieved a stack of papers, some of them yellowed with age, others still crisp with the freshness of more recent writings. She handed them over to Holmes, who carefully sorted through the pile, his sharp eyes scanning each document with practiced speed. Here, he said, holding up a page that appeared to be an old letter. This is interesting. It seems to be written in a code as well. I've seen this before, Watson. This is a form of shorthand, used by several embassies in Europe. I suspect this letter is from one of your husband's foreign contacts. Mrs. Pembroke's breath caught in her throat. A contact? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. Who? Holmes held up the letter, his finger tracing the coded symbols as though mapping out a hidden path. I cannot say yet, but I believe it will be of great importance. We will need to track down this individual, or perhaps this group, and learn exactly what they were involved in with Sir Edward. We must also determine the reason behind these cryptic messages and why they were hidden in plain sight. Mr. Holmes, Mrs. Pembroke said, her voice now full of urgency. Are you suggesting that my husband was a part of some larger conspiracy? That he was involved in espionage? Holmes met her gaze directly, his voice low but firm. I cannot say for certain yet, Mrs. Pembroke, but I do believe your husband was more than a mere diplomat. His work seems to have crossed into areas of covert intelligence and quite possibly affairs of state. We must proceed with caution, But this is no ordinary will or inheritance matter. There are far greater stakes involved. I watched Holmes carefully, taking in the complexity of the case. He was right, of course. There was something much larger at play here. Something that, if it were ever exposed, could cause ripples throughout the very foundations of the British government. "Where do we begin, Holmes?" I asked, eager to make progress in what was sure to be a tangled and dangerous mystery. Holmes placed the journal down with a deliberate motion and turned to Mrs. Pembroke. "First, I will need to speak with anyone who had dealings with your husband in the months before his death. I will also need access to his personal correspondence and any additional books that might contain further codes or symbols. This cipher will be our guide, but we must understand its context. Only then can we hope to crack it." Mrs. Pembroke nodded and left the room, presumably to gather the remaining materials Holmes had requested. As she departed, Holmes turned to me with a smile that was both weary and knowing. "Watson, I must confess, I do enjoy a good puzzle. And this one—" He paused, his eyes glinting with excitement. "This one will be a challenge indeed." I returned his smile, fully aware that this case was unlike anything we had encountered before. A forged will, a secret cipher, and whispers of espionage. It seemed that we were on the cusp of uncovering a scandal of monumental proportions. As I prepared myself for what lay ahead, I couldn't help but wonder just how deep this mystery ran, and what danger would await us as we unraveled the secrets of the widow's cipher. Later that evening, Holmes and I set out for a visit to Sir Edward's former colleagues. I could see the storm clouds gathering over London as we stepped into the darkening streets, the weight of the investigation settling upon us like a heavy cloak. Mrs. Pembroke had arranged for a contact to help us with the deciphering of the letter, and Holmes was intent on making further progress. But with every step, the mystery deepened, and the shadows of the past seemed to grow larger. The secrets of Sir Edward Pembroke's life and his death were waiting to be uncovered, and I had the distinct feeling that they would reveal far more than we were prepared for. Chapter 3. A Trail of Shadows. The following morning, Holmes and I made our way to the office of Sir Edward Pembroke's former colleague, Lord Howard Ellsworth, a distinguished member of the British diplomatic corps. Sir Edward had worked closely with Ellsworth in the years leading up to his retirement, and it was through Ellsworth that the majority of Sir Edward's international dealings had been arranged. Lord Ellsworth's townhouse stood in the heart of Westminster, its stone facade marred only by the creeping ivy that clung to its exterior, the same ivy that seemed to envelop the shadows of a past that refused to remain buried. As we approached the door, I noticed that the house was unusually quiet. No sounds of footsteps echoed from within, and there was no sign of life in the windows, save for a faint glimmer of light from the top floor. Holmes, ever the perceptive observer, didn't seem concerned by the stillness. He gave the doorbell a swift press, and we waited. A few moments passed before a servant appeared, her expression wary yet respectful. She opened the door wide enough for us to pass through. "Mr. Holmes," she said, addressing him with a hint of surprise in her voice, "His lordship is expecting you." Holmes nodded curtly and followed her up the grand staircase, I in tow. The house smelled of old leather and dust, the air thick with the weight of history. Each step seemed to echo with the silence of untold stories. The servant led us into a drawing room adorned with plush furniture, the walls lined with bookshelves containing numerous volumes on history, politics, and international relations. Lord Ellsworth sat behind a desk, his posture stiff and formal, his once dark hair now streaked with silver. His sharp eyes remained fixed on us, giving nothing away. He had the air of a man who had seen much but never spoken about it. When he saw Holmes, however, his features softened ever so slightly, and he stood to offer a handshake. "Holmes," he said, his voice deep and gravelly. "I assume you're here to inquire after Sir Edward's affairs? His death was tragic, yes, but I do not see how it could pertain to any matters of state. The man was retired." Holmes did not immediately shake his hand. Instead, he surveyed the room, his eyes darting across the various objects within it, taking in everything from the decorative rug beneath their feet to the subtle arrangement of papers scattered on the desk. I believe, Lord Ellsworth, that Sir Edward's death is far from a simple tragedy. Holmes replied, his voice calm but carrying an undercurrent of certainty. In fact, I would say that it is anything but ordinary. You see, Sir Edward's passing was not the result of natural causes, as his will would suggest, but of something much more insidious. His death, his entire life, was entangled in a network of secrets, and I intend to uncover the truth. Lord Ellsworth's face tightened, his eyes flicking momentarily toward the windows, as if searching for an escape from the conversation. But he was a man of discipline, and after a brief hesitation, he lowered himself back into his chair. I know nothing of any secrets, Holmes. Sir Edward and I were colleagues for many years. He served with honor, as did I. Perhaps there are others who may have more insight into whatever mysteries you seek. Holmes regarded him coolly, his gaze never wavering. It is precisely that, your colleague's honor, that intrigues me, Lord Ellsworth. You see, Sir Edward, in his last days, alluded to secrets too dangerous to reveal. I find that a curious statement, particularly when coupled with the unusual behavior of his will and the odd cipher found in his private journal. Lord Ellsworth's face remained impassive, though I noticed his hand twitch slightly, betraying a hint of unease. He cleared his throat. Holmes, I am not the person you seek. Sir Edward's dealings were entirely above board. You must understand, the world diplomacy is fraught with matters that, if left unresolved, could have dire consequences. But Sir Edward was not involved in any conspiracies, if that is what you are suggesting. Holmes, undeterred, leaned forward slightly, his eyes narrowing in on Lord Ellsworth. And yet, when I examined Sir Edward's personal library, I found coded messages hidden in the margins of his books. His correspondence with foreign dignitaries was marked with peculiar symbols and notes. What, then, should I make of these? Are they the harmless scribblings of a retired man, or the marks of someone hiding something? Lord Ellsworth's lips pressed together in a thin line, but he said nothing. Holmes continued, pressing the issue further. I believe your involvement in Sir Edward's life goes far deeper than mere friendship. I suspect that you were part of something much more dangerous, something far larger than mere diplomacy. These symbols and codes were not meant to remain hidden. They were meant to send a message, but to whom and why? A long silence followed as Lord Ellsworth stared at Holmes, his jaw clenched, his eyes calculating. Finally, he stood up abruptly, his movements stiff. I will say no more on this matter. You will have to look elsewhere for your answers. I have no further insight into Sir Edward's affairs. Holmes's expression darkened ever so slightly, but he did not back down. I think you will reconsider, Lord Ellsworth. Secrets like these have a way of revealing themselves, whether you wish them to or not, and I assure you, I will not stop until I have the full picture. Now, if you will excuse us, we will take our leave. As we made our way out of the room, I could see that Holmes's suspicions had not been unfounded. Lord Ellsworth's nervousness had been palpable. There was something more to the man's relationship with Sir Edward than met the eye. The question now was not just what the cipher revealed, but what lengths people would go to in order to keep the truth buried. Once outside, Holmes turned to me with a look of grim determination in his eyes. The game is afoot, Watson. Ellsworth's reluctance to discuss Sir Edward's final years speaks volumes. It is clear that the retired diplomat's death was far from a natural one. He was involved in something much larger than we had initially suspected. I nodded, feeling the weight of the mystery settling in. You're suggesting that Lord Ellsworth knows more than he's letting on? Precisely, Holmes replied, his gaze fixed on the horizon. And I suspect he is not the only one. There are powerful forces at work here, Watson. Forces that will do anything to keep the truth hidden. As we made our way back to Baker Street, I felt the growing tension of the investigation. The deeper we dug, the darker the mystery seemed to become. We were no longer dealing with a mere will or a simple family inheritance dispute. No, this was something far more sinister, something tied to the very heart of the British government. And as the fog began to roll in over the Thames, I knew one thing for certain. The widow's cipher had only just begun to unravel. Chapter 4. The Cipher's Key. The streets of London were uncharacteristically quiet as Holmes and I made our way back to Baker Street after our visit to Lord Ellsworth's townhouse. The fog that had rolled in earlier had thickened, cloaking the city in a damp, suffocating embrace. As I looked around at the indistinct shapes of pedestrians and carriages, I couldn't shake the feeling that something darker was brewing beneath the surface of our investigation. Back at our rooms, Holmes wasted no time in turning his attention to the puzzle at hand. He immediately set to work, pacing the floor, muttering to himself as he meticulously sorted through the papers and books Sir Edward Pembroke had left behind. I, on the other hand, took a seat at the desk and began to peruse the notes from our earlier conversation with Lord Ellsworth. As much as I tried to make sense of the situation, the clues before us seemed too scattered, too obscure to form a coherent picture. I turned to Holmes. "Do you believe Lord Ellsworth is involved in Sir Edward's death, Holmes?" Holmes paused in his pacing, his fingers absent-mindedly running over the spine of one of the books in Sir Edward's library. He fixed me with a steely gaze, as if searching for the right words. "Watson, I have no doubt that Lord Ellsworth is hiding something," Holmes replied, his voice low and deliberate. He was far too nervous when we mentioned Sir Edward's personal correspondence. That reaction, combined with the peculiar symbols we found in Sir Edward's journals, leads me to believe that Sir Edward was not just a man of diplomacy, but a man deeply embroiled in something dangerous, something that Ellsworth knew of and perhaps even helped to facilitate. He began pacing again, his mind clearly working at a rapid pace. But that is not the heart of the matter. What truly intrigues me is the cipher we uncovered. It is not merely a coded message, Watson. It is a key to something much larger, something that could shake the very foundations of Her Majesty's government. I frowned, still struggling to understand. But how can we decipher it, Holmes? We've been over it again and again, and it remains a mystery. Holmes stopped pacing and turned to me, a faint glimmer of excitement in his eyes. But that is where you are mistaken, my dear Watson. The answer is hidden in plain sight. Sir Edward was a man of great intellect, and this cipher is not some arbitrary code. It is a message that was meant to be found by someone who could see beyond the surface, someone who understood the intricacies of power, diplomacy, and secrecy. He walked over to the desk and retrieved a small, worn notebook from the pile of papers Sir Edward had kept. Opening it carefully, he began flipping through the pages. "Here it is," Holmes muttered, stopping at a particular page. It was a passage that seemed to be a collection of notes and observations, fragments of conversations, cryptic symbols, and dates. Sir Edward was meticulous in documenting everything, Holmes explained. These notes, Watson, are not random. They form part of a larger strategy, a plan that spans years, and the key to understanding them lies in the margins. Look closely. I leaned over the desk and examined the page Holmes had opened. At first glance, it appeared to be a jumble of disconnected thoughts, some written in English, others in French, and a few in a script that I could not immediately recognize. However, as my eyes moved over the page, I saw that certain phrases were underlined, while others had small, seemingly insignificant symbols drawn beside them. These symbols, like the ones we had encountered in the journal, were the key, I realized. "This is it, Watson," Holmes said, his voice now filled with excitement. "This is the cipher." He began to draw connections between the symbols and the underlined phrases, working feverishly to decode the message. It's not a simple substitution cipher or a numerical code. This is a cipher of association, where each symbol corresponds to a specific idea, event, or person. Sir Edward was using his own shorthand, a system that only someone with access to his knowledge would be able to interpret. Holmes worked for several more minutes, scribbling furiously in his notebook. Finally, he looked up, his face a mixture of triumph and apprehension. "I have it," he said softly. "This cipher points to something, Watson. A scandal, perhaps, or a secret that Sir Edward and Lord Ellsworth were both involved in. But more than that, it points to a specific date, one that seems to be of great significance." I leaned forward eagerly. "What date, Holmes?" "The 10th of September, 1871, Holmes replied, his voice tight with suppressed excitement. "It appears that something crucial took place on that date, something that both Sir Edward and Ellsworth were involved in. and whatever it was kept hidden from the public eye for a reason. I glanced at the cipher again, but it was as though the pieces were still out of reach. But what does it mean, Holmes? How do we use this information? Holmes's gaze darkened, and he folded the paper neatly before slipping it into his jacket pocket. It means that we must investigate that specific date, Watson. We must uncover what occurred on September 10th, 1871. If we can find out what took place on that day, then the rest of the puzzle will fall into place. Before I could respond, there was a sudden knock at the door. Holmes's sharp eyes darted toward it, and he motioned for me to remain silent. He stood up and went to answer it, revealing the figure of Inspector Lestrade standing in the doorway, his face grim. "Holmes," Lestrade said, his voice tinged with urgency, "I've come to you with new information. We've uncovered something you'll want to see." Holmes raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "What is it, Lestrade?" Lestrade hesitated for a moment before stepping into the room, his eyes darting toward me. "It's about Sir Edward Pembroke. We found something at his residence, something that links him directly to the government. A series of confidential documents, official papers, Holmes, and they're marked with the same symbols we saw in his journals." Holmes's eyes gleamed with an intensity I had rarely seen before. "That's precisely what we needed to confirm, Lestrade," he said, a note of satisfaction in his voice. "I knew there was more to this than a mere inheritance dispute. There's a much larger story here, and it is beginning to take shape." Lestrade nodded, his expression hardening. "There's more, Holmes. These papers, they seem to be connected to an international affair, something involving foreign diplomats and political alliances. I believe we've stumbled upon a conspiracy that reaches to the highest levels of government." Holmes turned toward me, his gaze intense. "Watson, the pieces are falling into place. We are no longer dealing with a simple inheritance. This is much bigger, and I fear that, before this case is through, many more will be involved." With a final look at the cipher, Holmes turned to Lestrade. "We must begin our investigation immediately. There is no time to waste. Every moment brings us closer to unraveling a scandal that could shake the foundations of this government. And so, with renewed urgency, we set out on the next leg of our journey. The puzzle was far from solved, but we were closer than ever before to uncovering the dangerous truth that lay hidden beneath the layers of secrets, lies, and codes that Sir Edward Pembroke had left behind. Chapter 5: The Shadow of September. The fog had not lifted, and the murky London streets seemed to stretch endlessly before us, thick with a sense of unease. Holmes, as usual, was preoccupied with the puzzle before him, turning over his thoughts as we made our way to a meeting with Lestrade and his team. The case had grown more intricate, and Holmes's mind was ablaze with possibilities, each more complex than the last. The letter's warning about hidden forces and a secret buried beneath the surface is tantalizing. It almost feels like a larger web of intrigue than just a diplomatic treaty. Could there be something tied to the power dynamics in the East? Perhaps something that challenges the British Empire's interests more directly than trade alone? Holmes' assertion that this could be about control makes me think, what if the treaty was just the facade for something deeper, like a covert power struggle or even a diplomatic maneuver to control resources or strategic locations in the East? Could the East hold not only physical resources, but a secret technology, a weapon, or some kind of rare artifact, something so critical that the Empire's very security depended on it? I imagine this secret could be one that involves not just the diplomats, but perhaps even royal figures or hidden factions within the government, each trying to protect or exploit whatever Pembroke had uncovered. And then the key, hidden in the smallest of places. That's an interesting clue. Could it refer to a literal object, a location, or perhaps even a person who holds the truth? I wonder if Holmes will have to navigate more political intrigue, or if this will turn into a race against time, with adversaries who want to keep this secret buried. There's so much potential for a vast conspiracy with layers upon layers of deception and betrayal. What do you think Holmes will focus on next? The treaty itself? The identity of Pembroke's intended recipient? Or the mysterious key that might unlock the truth? "The cipher, Watson," Holmes said suddenly, turning back to face me. "We must revisit it. Sir Edward's words in the letter, "Find the key," are a direct reference to the cipher. If we can decode the symbols and words in that notebook, we may very well uncover the truth. But how, Holmes? I asked. We've been over it so many times. There's no clear pattern. There is a pattern, Watson. You simply need to know where to look. Holmes's eyes gleamed. The cipher is not about numbers or straightforward letter substitution. It is about connections. Connections to certain places, events, and people that Pembroke knew would be significant. The 10th of September was merely the beginning. What happened that day was the culmination of years of careful planning, and it is that plan that we must unravel. Lestrade cleared his throat. I don't understand, Holmes. You're saying that Pembroke was part of a conspiracy that goes beyond a treaty, beyond government politics? Holmes nodded. Exactly, Lestrade. This conspiracy stretches far beyond simple diplomacy. It's a matter of national security. And the figures involved, Lord Ellsworth, the diplomats, and the men who met on that fateful day, are all part of a greater scheme. One that, if exposed, could bring down the entire government. The room grew silent, the weight of Holmes's words settling on us like a heavy fog. I could see the toll this case was beginning to take on Lestrade. He had always been a man of action, one who preferred straightforward answers to elusive mysteries. But even he could not deny the gravity of what we were uncovering. What do we do now? Lestrade asked, his voice strained. Holmes glanced at me before answering. We must return to Pembroke's library. There is something we missed. Something small, hidden in plain sight. And once we find it, the rest will become clear. The inspector nodded reluctantly. Very well. I'll have my men gather all the relevant documents. But Holmes, we're walking on dangerous ground here. If there's truly a conspiracy at play, we could be walking into a hornet's nest. Danger is a constant companion in our line of work, Lestrade, Holmes replied with a slight smile. And I have no intention of being caught unaware. With that, we made our preparations to return to Sir Edward's townhouse, our minds now fully focused on the cryptic messages that had yet to be revealed. The key to the cipher, to the truth that happened on September 10th, 1871, was within our grasp. And soon, very soon, we would discover the secrets that Sir Edward Pembroke had left behind. Chapter 6. The Clocks and the Cipher. The evening air was heavy with the promise of rain as we stood outside Sir Edward Pembroke's grand townhouse, a Victorian structure perched on a quiet street in Mayfair. The gas lamps flickered in the damp air, casting long shadows over the polished stone facade. Holmes adjusted his coat, his eyes scanning the windows for any sign of movement inside. We had returned to the house with Lestrade and a team of his men, all prepared to unearth more of Pembroke's secrets. As we ascended the steps to the front door, the creak of the old wood beneath our boots seemed to echo through the narrow street. Lestrade had insisted that we take his men along, but Holmes had quickly dismissed the notion. The fewer the distractions, Lestrade, he had said, the better. I will need to concentrate without unnecessary interference. Inside the house, the air was stale, the silence broken only by the occasional shift of the house's settling timbers. The faint scent of tobacco lingered in the rooms, a reminder of Pembroke's habits. Holmes strode purposefully to the library, where we had first uncovered the cipher. Lestrade followed closely behind, his expression one of quiet determination. I trust you have secured the house, Lestrade? Holmes asked, his voice low but firm. Of course, Lestrade replied, his eyes scanning the hallway. The place is under watch. No one has come or gone since we arrived. Holmes nodded, a glimmer of satisfaction passing through his eyes. Good. Now, let's see if we can uncover more of Pembroke's hidden messages. The library was vast, its shelves brimming with books on a myriad of topics. It was clear that Pembroke had been an avid reader, but there was something disjointed about the arrangement of the volumes. Some books appeared well-worn, while others seemed untouched for years. Holmes immediately began his inspection, walking between the shelves with the intensity of a man possessed by a singular purpose. I joined him, my curiosity piqued. The cipher, those strange notations Pembroke had left behind, was still at the forefront of my mind. Holmes, I ventured, do you believe that the key to the cipher is hidden somewhere here? Holmes glanced at me, a hint of a smile curving his lips. Of course, Watson. It's all a matter of context. A man like Pembroke, he was a man of discipline, of order. He would not have scattered his secrets haphazardly. Everything he left behind must be tied to something larger, a code within a book, or perhaps a message hidden in plain sight. Lestrade, who had been examining the surrounding area, spoke up. Holmes, are you suggesting that the cipher is tied to a specific book? That it could be encoded within the pages of Pembroke's collection? I am indeed, Holmes replied, his eyes gleaming. In fact, I suspect the cipher was specifically designed to blend in with Pembroke's vast library, which is why it has evaded detection until now. The key to the cipher is in the pattern. There's always a pattern. As Holmes continued his search, Lestrade and I began to sift through the piles of books on the nearby desk, where Pembroke had obviously spent countless hours working. But it was Holmes who found the first clue. He stopped abruptly, his hand hovering over a dusty leather-bound volume near the far wall. His fingers brushed over the spine of the book, and with a sharp exhale, he pulled it from the shelf. "What is it?" I asked, stepping closer. Holmes held up the book for me to see. It was a worn, maroon volume with no title on the spine. He opened it with a practiced hand and flipped through several pages before stopping near the center of the book. "This, Watson," Holmes said quietly, "is where our solution lies." I peered over his shoulder and saw the page he had opened to. It was filled with neat, handwritten notes, seemingly innocuous at first glance. But as Holmes ran his finger along the margin, something caught my eye. There, scribbled in the fine ink, was a sequence of numbers. "This is it," Holmes murmured, his voice tinged with excitement. "This is the next piece of the puzzle." Lestrade, who had been observing from the doorway, stepped closer. "What are those numbers, Holmes?" Holmes glanced at him, his lips curling into a faint smile. "These, Lestrade, are not just numbers, they are coordinates. Coordinates to a place, a location. And it is there, I believe, that we will find the key to the cipher, and to the conspiracy that Sir Edward Pembroke was trying to reveal." I leaned in closer, examining the page. "Coordinates? But to where?" Holmes did not answer immediately. Instead, he carefully transcribed the numbers onto a piece of scrap paper and handed it to Lestrade. "I suggest you have your men look into these, Lestrade. Find out where they lead." Lestrade nodded, though his brow furrowed in confusion. "Very well, Holmes. But this is all rather cryptic, don't you think? We're supposed to follow numbers?" Holmes looked up from his work, his expression as serious as ever. "Indeed, Lestrade, you'll find that the most puzzling of clues are often the most straightforward when you examine them carefully." Turning his attention back to the book, Holmes continued to search through the pages, his eyes flicking rapidly across the text. He stopped again, his brow furrowing in concentration. "And here, Watson," he said, pointing to another passage, "is the most crucial part of the cipher." The passage was a single line of text, written in a delicate, looping script. It appeared to be a cryptic message, but the meaning was unclear. "The final key lies beneath the silence of time," Holmes read aloud. "Only the keeper of the past may reveal what the future holds." I frowned. "What does it mean?" Holmes looked up at me, his expression thoughtful. "It means that the cipher is not only about hidden messages in books or coordinates. It's about time itself. Pembroke was a man who lived by the clock, a man who valued the passage of time and understood its power. And I believe the answer lies in the clocks themselves." Lestrade seemed perplexed. "Clocks? What does this have to do with clocks?" Holmes met his gaze. "The clocks are part of Pembroke's legacy, Lestrade. He was not just a diplomat, he was a master clockmaker. The key to his cipher, his final message, must be tied to the very concept of time. We need to examine Pembroke's personal collection of clocks. If I'm correct, one of them will contain the final piece of the puzzle." The room seemed to grow colder as the weight of Holmes's words settled over us. The clocks in Pembroke's collection, what secrets did they hold? What had Sir Edward hidden within the mechanisms of his creations? It was a mystery that only time itself could unravel. "We'll start tomorrow," Holmes said, breaking the silence. "We'll search every clock in this house if we must. The answers are here, Lestrade. We're closer than we've ever been to discovering the truth." Lestrade nodded, his voice steady. "Right, Holmes. We'll have the place secured. You do your work, and I'll get the men ready." As we prepared to leave the library, I couldn't help but feel that we were on the brink of something monumental. The clocks had begun to tick louder in my mind, and I wondered what they might reveal. It seemed that with every passing moment, we were drawing closer to uncovering the dark secrets that had been buried for years. And yet, as Holmes had so often said, the most dangerous mysteries were the ones that could not be solved with reason alone. This case was about to lead us into the very heart of a conspiracy that had the power to shake the foundations of the British government itself. The adventure was only just beginning, and I had no doubt that it would take all of Holmes's ingenuity, and perhaps more than a little luck, to unravel the final hidden secrets of Sir Edward Pembroke's legacy. Chapter 7. Beneath the Hands of Time. The following day arrived with a gray, overcast sky that seemed to reflect the mood of the house we found ourselves in. The atmosphere in Sir Edward Pembroke's residence was thick with anticipation, as though the walls themselves were holding their breath, waiting for the truth to emerge. Holmes had already spent the morning sketching out a plan. His mind was singular in purpose, uncovering the secrets that Pembroke had concealed within his elaborate clock collection. Lestrade, true to his word, had arrived early with a handful of constables and the remnants of his team, ready for whatever Holmes required. Though I could see in his eyes that the inspector was no less bewildered by the cryptic messages than he had been the night before, he deferred to Holmes with a trust that only deepened as the mystery advanced. Holmes, for his part, had never been more engaged. His mind seemed to be working at a pace that outstripped even my ability to follow along. The books in the library had now been stacked and set aside, replaced by the cold, ticking watches and clocks that covered the room like a sea of timepieces. "Do you suppose," I asked as Holmes peered at the ticking devices with an intensity that could crack stone, "that Pembroke's entire life revolved around time? I've never seen a man so obsessed." Holmes looked up, a brief spark of amusement passing over his sharp features. "Time, Watson, is both a master and a servant. A man like Pembroke, retired diplomat, clockmaker, he understood time as few others did. It is fitting, then, that his secrets would be hidden within it." The house had indeed become a sanctuary for timepieces. Nearly every room we entered seemed to hold another clock or watch. There was a grandfather clock in the hallway, a mantelpiece clock in the study, and even small pocket watches and elegant desk clocks scattered across the desks and shelves. As we ventured deeper into Pembroke's world, I began to feel a profound sense of unease, a sensation I could not entirely place. "We'll begin with this," Holmes said suddenly, pointing to a small, delicately crafted clock resting atop a glass table near the far corner of the room. It was a striking timepiece, antique, no doubt, but still remarkably well preserved. I moved toward it, examining the clock's intricate design. The case was made of polished mahogany, the face adorned with Roman numerals, and the minute and hour hands were shaped like graceful swans, frozen in motion. But it was something else that drew my attention. The second hand, the one that ticked away in silent rhythm, seemed to move erratically. "Holmes, look at this," I called, but Holmes was already by my side, his keen eyes scanning the clock with swift precision. "It's peculiar," he muttered, crouching down to examine the clock's inner workings through a small pane of glass. "It's as though the second hand has been tampered with. No natural motion at all. Watson, I believe this is the first clue." "What do you mean? It's just a clock." "No," Holmes said, standing and taking a step back. "It is much more than that. I suspect this clock was altered deliberately. If Pembroke was trying to hide something, he would have known that this detail would go unnoticed by most. But not by me." Lestrade, standing at the doorway and clearly not following, stepped forward, squinting at the clock. "What exactly are you getting at, Holmes? What's so special about a stopped second hand?" Holmes turned to Lestrade with a thoughtful look. "It's a hidden message, Lestrade, an encoded signal." "But how could that be?" Lestrade asked, genuinely puzzled. "It's just a clock, Holmes." "I don't believe it is," Holmes replied, pacing as his mind spun with a new theory. "If you look carefully at the design of the hands, especially the second hand, it isn't merely out of sync. It seems to follow a deliberate, irregular pattern. It's as if the second hand is telling a story." I nodded slowly, beginning to understand the direction of his thinking. You mean the hand is moving in a specific way to communicate something? Holmes stopped pacing and turned toward me. Precisely, Watson. The irregularity of the second hand could indicate a cipher, a coded message in plain sight. Lestrade looked uncertain, but nonetheless interested. So, we've got a clock with a second hand that doesn't work properly. How does that help us? Holmes's eyes gleamed with excitement. Lestrade, it's not the malfunction that's important. It's the pattern. This clock has been designed to hide a message that only someone who understands the way time works can decode. We must examine the pattern of the hand's irregular motion and cross-reference it with the cipher Pembroke left behind in his books. Holmes was already opening the back of the clock, and I moved forward to assist him. The back panel came off with a soft click, revealing the intricate gears and cogs that powered the timepiece. Holmes scrutinized the mechanism, his fingers tracing the movements of the gears as though he were reading a book. "You see," he murmured, "the second hand isn't simply halted at irregular intervals. It stops at certain points, and when it does, the mechanism behind it shifts." Lestrade leaned in, confused. "What are you talking about?" "I'll show you," Holmes said, his voice cool and confident. He gestured for Lestrade to stand aside, and with a deft twist of his wrist, Holmes moved a few of the gears. The clock shuddered and began ticking again, but now the second hand moved with unnatural pauses, halting at certain fixed positions as though caught by invisible hands. "Pay attention," Holmes said, his gaze fixed on the second hand. "It pauses at specific intervals, 3 times in total, before it completes a full rotation." Holmes muttered under his breath, and I realized that he was counting the stops of the second hand. 1, 2, 3. The clock chimed once, its delicate bells ringing a high, faint note. "There it is," Holmes said quietly, as though something had clicked into place. He quickly moved over to the nearby desk where a sheet of paper sat, filled with the numbers Pembroke had written out. He glanced at the numbers, then back to the clock. The pattern, the pauses of the second hand, aligned perfectly with the numbers written in the margin notes. "What are you deducing, Holmes?" I asked, unable to suppress my curiosity. Holmes did not answer immediately. Instead, he was scribbling quickly, his handwriting precise. He drew a few lines across the paper, marking a few intersections, then paused and looked up at Lestrade. "Lestrade, I need you to fetch me a map of the city, the one Pembroke had. You'll find it in the second drawer of his desk." Lestrade hesitated but did as requested, and soon returned with the map. Holmes spread it out on the desk, his eyes scanning it quickly, tracing lines on the paper with his finger. "The coordinates!" I exclaimed, understanding dawning on me. "Yes." Holmes replied, "The cipher from the books and the clock are linked. Pembroke was revealing something important, something hidden beneath time itself, and now we know where to look." I could feel the excitement building inside me. "Where, Holmes? Where do we go?" Holmes didn't answer immediately, but his eyes glinted with the satisfaction of a puzzle nearly solved. "To the heart of London, Watson, to a place that bears the weight of history and, I believe, the key to Pembroke's final secret. But first, we need to decode the final piece of the pattern." Holmes turned to Lestrade with a look of determination. "Prepare yourself. We are about to uncover something that will shock the very foundations of the British government. We'll need all our wits about us." Lestrade nodded, understanding now that the investigation had moved beyond mere theft or forgery. It had become something much larger, something that could rock the establishment itself. I watched as Holmes turned his attention back to the clock, his mind clearly racing through the implications. The cogs and gears of the clock were no longer simply mechanical components. They were symbols, each one a part of a much grander puzzle. And I knew, in that moment, that the game was afoot once more. Chapter 8: The Hidden Hour. The morning mist had not yet fully dissipated when Holmes, Lestrade, and I arrived at the location that Pembroke's clock had pointed us to. An ancient, ivy-clad building situated at the edge of the city, tucked between narrow cobblestone streets and obscured by tall, aging buildings that seemed to have watched the passage of centuries. The building itself stood inconspicuously, as though its purpose was a secret even to the people who walked past it daily. Its weathered facade gave no hint of the mystery concealed within its walls. Holmes stood before the building, his sharp eyes scanning the area with a practiced ease. His face was taut with concentration, his fingers drumming lightly against the side of his coat, a clear indication that he was deep in thought. Beside him, Lestrade shuffled nervously, his hands clasped behind his back as he surveyed the surroundings, his brow furrowed in confusion. "This place," I ventured, "it hardly looks like the sort of place a man of Pembroke's stature would associate with. What do you make of it, Holmes?" Holmes didn't respond immediately. His gaze remained fixed on the weather-worn stone door, which, despite its age, appeared to be impeccably cared for, the brass knocker gleaming faintly in the morning light. "It is precisely because it appears so inconspicuous, Watson, that Pembroke would have found it a perfect place to hide a secret," Holmes said, his voice low but firm. "A man who dealt with high politics, with power and influence, would never place such things in plain sight. This, however, is a different story, one that operates in the shadows, out of the sight of the public eye." Lestrade cleared his throat, visibly impatient. "Holmes, if you don't mind me asking, what are we even looking for in there?" "The clock was certainly a clue, but it doesn't make much sense to me. What kind of secret would Pembroke want to hide in a place like this?" Holmes turned to Lestrade, his expression filled with quiet resolve. "A very powerful secret, I suspect, one that could bring about a scandal of monumental proportions if revealed. Pembroke was no mere diplomat, Lestrade. He had a front-row seat to the intricacies of international relations, and I have no doubt that, in his final days, he feared the consequences of the truth coming to light." "Then what are we waiting for?" Lestrade asked, his voice a mixture of exasperation and intrigue. Holmes gave a small, enigmatic smile and nodded toward the door. "The key, Lestrade, is not in the door, but what lies behind it." With that, Holmes stepped forward and grasped the brass knocker, giving it a firm yet deliberate pull. The sound echoed through the narrow street knot, startling a pair of pigeons perched on a nearby windowsill. Moments later, a figure appeared from behind the door. It was an elderly man, with a long white beard and sharp, observant eyes. His gaze flicked over each of us, lingering just a moment too long on Lestrade. "Yes?" the man asked, his voice raspy, yet unmistakably authoritative. "We are here to investigate the late Sir Edward Pembroke," Holmes began, his voice carrying a tone of absolute certainty. "We have reason to believe that certain matters relating to his estate were concealed here, and we require access to this building." The man stood silent for a moment, his eyes narrowing ever so slightly. Then, without a word, he stepped aside and gestured for us to enter. The creak of the heavy door as it swung open sounded like a warning, and I could not shake the feeling that we were walking into a carefully constructed trap. As we entered, the smell of musty books and old paper filled the air. The interior of the building was dim, lit only by a few flickering oil lamps that cast long shadows across the room. The floors were covered in dust, and towering shelves lined the walls, filled with rows upon rows of weathered books and manuscripts. Holmes immediately moved toward the far end of the room, where a large desk sat beneath a window. The desk was cluttered with papers, all neatly organized, yet somehow there was something about the space that made it feel like it was ready to be searched. Lestrade moved toward the nearest shelf, running his hand along the spines of the books, clearly intrigued by the vast collection of materials that filled the space. He picked up a volume titled The Rise and Fall of Empires and flipped it open. "Nothing here," he muttered. Holmes, on the other hand, was already inspecting the desk. His eyes gleamed as he opened the drawers, each one revealing more documents, but none that seemed to contain the secrets we were looking for. "Ah!" Holmes exclaimed suddenly, pulling out a small, worn book. It appeared to be a ledger of sorts, its leather cover cracked and frayed with age. Holmes thumbed through the pages with expert precision, his fingers tracing the ink as if he were reading between the lines. "What is it, Holmes?" I asked, moving closer. Holmes didn't look up, but gestured toward the door at the far end of the room. "Lestrade, go to the back. I believe this leads to another room, one that may hold the answers we seek." Lestrade eyed Holmes suspiciously, but did as instructed, stepping out of the room and disappearing down a narrow hallway. Holmes, meanwhile, continued to flip through the pages of the ledger, his brow furrowing as he read. "There it is," he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. I leaned over his shoulder and looked at the page he had stopped on. The ink was faded, but the writing was still legible. It contained names, dates, and a series of coded symbols that seemed to correspond to certain events in Pembroke's diplomatic career. Each entry was marked with a different number of dashes, some with 2, others with 3, and a few with 4. It was a cipher, I realized, one that could unlock the secrets Pembroke had hidden. Holmes continued to work in silence, his hands steady as he translated the cipher. "This," he said after a few moments, "is a key to Pembroke's most carefully guarded secrets. I believe it was meant for someone with the knowledge to decipher it." Before I could ask further, Lestrade returned, looking flushed with excitement. "Holmes, you were right. There's another room in the back. It's full of documents, government papers, official seals. But there's something more. Come quickly." Holmes shot to his feet, the ledger now firmly in his grasp. "Lead the way, Lestrade," he commanded, his voice filled with a sense of urgency. We followed Lestrade down the narrow hall and into a small, dimly lit room at the back of the building. It was smaller than the main room, but its contents were far more interesting. Shelves lined the walls, but instead of books, they were filled with cabinets, drawers, and large wooden boxes. In the center of the room stood a large table, piled high with stacks of documents. Lestrade wasted no time, pulling open one of the drawers. Inside, we found more of the same: government papers, intelligence reports, and confidential correspondence. But what caught our attention was the folder lying atop the pile. It was sealed with a wax insignia, one I recognized instantly. "That's Her Majesty's government seal," I exclaimed. Holmes nodded slowly, his eyes narrowing. "Precisely, Watson. These documents, these secrets, were never meant to be uncovered. Pembroke was part of something far larger than we anticipated. His death was no accident." Lestrade picked up the folder, carefully breaking the wax seal. As he opened it, Holmes and I leaned in to read the contents. The papers inside were damning, detailing a covert operation that had been orchestrated by Pembroke himself, a political scandal that involved several prominent figures in Her Majesty's government. "It's worse than I thought," Holmes said quietly. Pembroke had been blackmailing certain individuals in the government, holding their past transgressions over their heads in exchange for his silence. Lestrade's face was pale as he looked up from the documents. So Pembroke wasn't just a diplomat. He was a blackmailer. Holmes glanced over at him. "Not just any blackmailer, Lestrade. He was a player in a much larger game, one involving the highest echelons of power. These documents are the key to understanding his motivations, and it is these very secrets that cost him his life." I looked at Holmes, a growing sense of dread forming in my chest. "Holmes, if these papers are as dangerous as they seem, could someone still be after them?" Holmes gave me a slow, almost imperceptible smile. "Precisely, Watson. Pembroke's death was only the beginning. We must now find who is behind it all before they can cover their tracks once again." As Holmes glanced at the papers, a sense of finality settled upon him. "The game, Lestrade, is far from over. We are merely scratching the surface of a conspiracy that could shake the very foundations of our government. We will expose it, but we must move quickly." Lestrade nodded grimly. "I'll get the constables. We need to bring this to the proper authorities." Holmes turned to me. "No, Lestrade, not yet. We need to follow the final clue first. Pembroke's ledger has shown us the way, and it is there that we will uncover the truth. Only then will we be able to bring the true culprits to justice." The moment was tense, and I could feel the weight of what was ahead of us. But I also knew that Holmes would lead us. Chapter 9, The Cipher's Key. The night had already fallen when we left the dilapidated building, and the streets of London were now shrouded in darkness. The fog had thickened even more, wrapping the city in a silent, ghostly embrace. The only sounds were the distant clattering of carriage wheels and the occasional call of a night watchman, though their voices were quickly swallowed by the dense fog. Lestrade, Holmes, and I walked in tense silence, each of us consumed by our own thoughts, processing the weight of what we had just uncovered. Holmes's mind, however, was already far ahead. His usual air of calm confidence was back, though there was a certain sharpness in his gaze, an energy that was almost palpable. He had, it seemed, found the first solid clue in the web that had entangled Pembroke's death. "Holmes," I began, breaking the silence. "What did you make of that letter? The coordinates. What was it about them?" Holmes didn't immediately answer. Instead, he stopped mid-step, his brow furrowing as he looked out toward the fog-cloaked city. His hand rested on the brim of his hat, but his mind was clearly elsewhere, spinning the details together. "The coordinates," he said after a long pause, his voice thoughtful, "are a starting point, Watson. They lead us to a location, a small building just outside the city center, near the docks. It's nothing more than a warehouse, as far as I can tell. But I have no doubt that there's something hidden within it, something Pembroke discovered before his untimely death." Lestrade, who had been walking alongside us with his hands tucked into his coat, seemed more uneasy than usual. "And you think we'll find something useful there?" he asked, his tone laced with skepticism. "A warehouse? Surely it's a stretch." Holmes shot Lestrade a quick, almost dismissive glance. "Lestrade, when dealing with such delicate matters as Pembroke's, the most inconspicuous places often hide the greatest secrets. Do you not recall the case of the missing royal jewels, where they were found in an abandoned building, hidden in the very heart of the city?" Lestrade paused, clearly unsure of how to respond. He had learned over the years that Holmes's theories, though often outlandish to the untrained eye, invariably proved correct. After a moment of hesitation, he nodded reluctantly. "I suppose you're right, Holmes. If you say we need to investigate that warehouse, then we'll investigate it." The detective's lips curled into a slight smile, but his focus remained unshaken. "We shall begin first thing tomorrow morning. But we must be cautious. There are forces at work here far beyond anything we can currently understand." Pembroke was not a mere diplomat. He was involved in matters of national security, no doubt. We continued on in silence, the fog swallowing us further with each step until we reached Baker Street. Holmes had fallen silent, and I knew better than to disturb him while his mind worked. Lestrade, too, seemed lost in thought, his earlier unease turning into suspicion. What had Pembroke been involved in, and why was his death wrapped in such secrecy? The next morning came with a strange, unsettling clarity. Holmes was already at work in his study, his brow furrowed as he pored over his notes from the previous night. His sharp eyes darted from one document to another, as though searching for some elusive piece of the puzzle. I took a seat at the table and watched him work in silence, knowing better than to interrupt. After what felt like hours, Holmes suddenly broke the silence. "Watson, I believe we have missed something crucial." I looked up, startled by the sudden intensity in his voice. "What do you mean? We've been over everything multiple times." Holmes's eyes gleamed with excitement. "No, Watson. The cipher. It was too obvious. Pembroke hid it in plain sight. We missed it because we weren't thinking like him. He wasn't merely encoding a message. He was leaving us a map, a key to his final discovery." I leaned forward, my interest piqued. "A map? You mean there's something hidden at the warehouse?" Holmes nodded, his fingers tapping rhythmically against the table. "Exactly. The cipher, you see, wasn't just a cryptic message. Pembroke encoded the coordinates into a specific pattern, one that, if deciphered properly, would reveal the location of something important. The key to it lies in the margin notes of his books. I had hoped we would find it, but I failed to recognize the complexity of his system." Lestrade entered the room just as Holmes made this revelation, his boots thudding against the floor. "What's this about a cipher?" he asked, sounding both intrigued and impatient. "I thought we were heading to the warehouse today." Holmes looked at him, his eyes sharp and calculating. "Patience, Lestrade. This cipher is far more important than any warehouse. Pembroke's secrets are not just hidden in physical objects. They are encoded in a way that reflects his vast knowledge of espionage and covert operations." Lestrade's brow furrowed in confusion. "So you're saying this cipher leads us to something more, something of greater importance than just a warehouse full of junk?" Holmes's gaze never wavered. "Indeed, Lestrade. Pembroke was a diplomat, but he was also a man who understood the power of information. He knew that the key to uncovering hidden truths would lie in plain sight, disguised as a series of seemingly innocuous notes and coordinates." Lestrade crossed his arms, clearly still skeptical. "And how do we break this cipher, then?" Holmes smiled, but it wasn't his usual confident grin. It was a smile of pure intellectual satisfaction. "We do not break it, Lestrade. We simply read it. Pembroke left us the key. He was far too meticulous for anything else." He stood and began rummaging through a collection of books from Pembroke's personal library. Each one was carefully annotated, and Holmes's fingers moved with practiced precision, flipping through the pages until he stopped abruptly at one particular volume. It was an old, leather-bound book on diplomacy and international relations, a subject I had never seen Pembroke show much interest in before. Holmes's fingers paused at a particular page, and a glint of triumph appeared in his eyes. "There it is," he said, almost to himself. "The key." I leaned in, watching as Holmes carefully traced his finger along a line of scribbled notes. The cipher was far more intricate than anything I had expected. Pembroke had taken meticulous care to embed his secret within the text, but to anyone without Holmes's trained eye, it would have appeared to be nothing more than ordinary commentary. But to Holmes, the pattern was unmistakable. "Do you see it, Watson?" he asked, his voice low but full of intensity. I looked closely at the notes, following the complex pattern of numbers and letters scrawled in the margins. It was a series of coordinates, yes, but they were scattered within the text like breadcrumbs, forming an intricate trail. "By Jove," I murmured. "You're right. This is a map, isn't it? It's more than just coordinates. It's a route." Holmes nodded. "Exactly. Pembroke's final discovery is hidden, and this cipher is the only way to unlock it." Lestrade's face, once full of skepticism, now seemed to be tinged with excitement. "And this will lead us to whatever it is Pembroke was trying to hide?" Holmes smiled again, this time with an almost mischievous glint in his eyes. "Precisely, Lestrade. Now we shall see what secrets this cipher will reveal." The path was set. There was no turning back now. We were on the trail of something far larger than we could have anticipated. And with each step forward, the stakes grew higher. As we gathered our things and prepared to leave for the warehouse, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were about to uncover something far more dangerous than we had bargained for. But Holmes, ever the optimist, seemed invigorated by the challenge. "Onward, Watson," he said, his voice full of determination. "The game is afoot." Chapter 10. The Secrets of the Warehouse. The air was heavy with the scent of wet stone and salt water as we approached the warehouse. The fog had not relented. In fact, it seemed to be creeping closer with each passing hour, wrapping the city in a damp, suffocating shroud. The streets were eerily quiet, save for the occasional distant rumble of a carriage or the low murmur of voices from the nearby dockworkers. We were near the edge of London now, where the industrial heart of the city met the murky waters of the Thames. Holmes had led the way, his long coat trailing behind him, his face illuminated only by the dim glow of a gaslight further down the street. Lestrade and I followed closely behind, our footsteps muffled by the thick fog. Lestrade's face, usually a mask of skepticism, was now drawn, his brow furrowed with concern. "I still don't understand why you think this warehouse is so important, Holmes," Lestrade said, his voice low as we drew closer. "You've told us there's something hidden here, something to do with Pembroke, but what could it possibly be? It's just an old, abandoned building." Holmes didn't answer immediately, his sharp eyes scanning the darkened structure ahead of us. The warehouse was a dreary, decaying sight, its windows broken or obscured by grime, the once proud brickwork now covered in moss and the telltale marks of neglect. The place looked deserted, but that only heightened the suspicion in Holmes's demeanor. "Lestrade," Holmes said quietly, turning to face him, "sometimes the most unremarkable locations hold the most significant truths. Pembroke's secrets are here, of that I am certain. We must be careful, though. There may be others who seek what he left behind, and they may not be as forgiving as we are." Lestrade looked unconvinced, but he said nothing more. His hand rested on the hilt of his revolver, the only outward sign of his unease. I, too, felt the weight of the situation pressing down on me, but I trusted Holmes's judgment. He had led us through many difficult situations before. As we reached the entrance, Holmes paused, holding up a hand to signal us to stop. The door to the warehouse was slightly ajar, the wooden frame creaking in protest as the wind pushed against it. Holmes knelt down and examined the doorframe carefully. his sharp eyes scanning for any signs of tampering or unusual marks. "Something is wrong," Holmes murmured, more to himself than to the rest of us. "There's been recent activity here." I bent down to inspect the door, noticing faint scratches along the edges. It was clear that the door had been forced open recently, and not with the greatest of care. A sense of foreboding crept up my spine, but I kept my composure. Holmes rose to his feet and gave a curt nod. We proceed with caution. Lestrade, remain at the ready. Watson, stay close." With that, Holmes pushed the door open slowly, revealing the dark interior of the warehouse. The air inside was thick with dust, and the dim light from the street lamp outside barely penetrated the gloom. Shadows danced across the floor, making it difficult to gauge the scale of the place. Holmes moved forward first, his movements measured and deliberate. He knew the importance of preserving their advantage. If there were enemies hidden within, it was better to surprise them first. Lestrade and I followed close behind, the creaking of our boots the only sound that accompanied us. As we ventured deeper into the warehouse, Holmes stopped suddenly, his hand raised again to signal us to halt. He bent down and examined a pile of crates stacked against one wall. There were no signs of movement, but the faintest smell of something foul lingered in the air. Holmes's eyes narrowed as he began to inspect the crates more closely. "Be on your guard," he said, his voice low. "There's something here we've overlooked, something hidden beneath these crates." Lestrade moved forward cautiously, his revolver at the ready. "Do you want us to check under the crates, Holmes?" Holmes nodded, his expression grim. Indeed, if Pembroke hid anything of value here, it would be beneath these very crates. We set to work, cautiously lifting the crates one by one. The pungent smell grew stronger as we moved further into the warehouse, the stench of decay filling our nostrils. It was clear that something had been disturbed. There was a sense of unease in the air, as though we were not alone in the vast, empty space. After a few minutes of laborious effort, we uncovered a trapdoor in the floor, half hidden beneath a stack of crates. The metal door had rusted with age, and the hinges creaked as Holmes pried it open. Beneath it lay a narrow, darkened staircase leading down into an unknown depth. Holmes stood at the edge of the trapdoor, staring down into the blackness below. "This is it," he said softly, more to himself than anyone else. "This is where Pembroke's secrets are buried." Lestrade looked at Holmes, then at the darkness below, a wary expression on his face. "Do you want me to go first, Holmes?" Holmes shook his head, his eyes never leaving the darkness below. "No, Lestrade. I'll go first. Stay close behind." With that, Holmes descended the stairs, his figure swallowed by the shadows. Lestrade followed closely, his revolver in hand. I was last, my heart pounding in my chest as I descended after them. The stairs creaked under our weight, the sound echoing in the silence of the warehouse. At the bottom of the stairs, we entered a small, dimly lit room. The air was musty, the walls damp with the chill of the underground. It was difficult to make out much at first, but as our eyes adjusted to the dim light, we saw what had been hidden here. Against one wall of the room, a large wooden table stood, its surface cluttered with maps, documents, and strange contraptions I could not immediately identify. On the far side of the room, a large cabinet stood against the wall, its doors ajar. From inside the cabinet, Holmes reached out and retrieved a bundle of papers, their edges yellowed with age. "These," he said, holding the papers up, "are the true secrets of Pembroke. The cipher, the coordinates, it was all leading here. These documents will explain everything." I stepped closer, my curiosity piqued. But as I reached out to take one of the papers from Holmes's hand, I froze. There, in the far corner of the room, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A figure, cloaked in shadow, stood motionless, watching us. Holmes, ever vigilant, had already drawn his revolver before I could react. "Stay back," he ordered, his voice cold and commanding. The figure did not move, but I could see the faint glint of something metallic in the dim light. Then, with a sudden, swift movement, the figure turned and bolted for the door at the far end of the room, disappearing into the shadows. "After him!" Lestrade shouted, already dashing toward the door. Holmes hesitated for a fraction of a second before following, his steps quick and purposeful. I, too, followed as we sprinted toward the door, but as we reached it, I heard a loud crash, followed by the distinct sound of hurried footsteps fading into the distance. The chase was on. Chapter 11, The Chase, Through the Docks. The pursuit had begun in earnest. The figure that had slipped from our grasp in the shadowy room of the warehouse was now just a fleeting shadow in the fog. We could hear the pounding footsteps ahead, echoing in the damp, empty streets of the docks. The scent of salt water and rotting wood mingled in the air, thick with the scent of industry and decay. The warehouse district, usually quiet at this hour, was now alive with the tension of a desperate chase. Lestrade's heavy boots pounded the cobblestones ahead of me, his revolver drawn and ready, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Holmes, his features hard as stone, moved with the practiced grace of a predator, seemingly unaffected by the cold or the damp air. The fog swirled around us, thickening by the second, and visibility became almost non-existent. "Keep up, Watson!" Holmes's voice was sharp as he surged ahead, his silhouette vanishing momentarily into the mist. I pushed forward, my heart racing, my legs burning from the exertion. I couldn't help but marvel at Holmes's speed and precision, even in such trying circumstances. Lestrade, despite his experience, was beginning to fall behind, the strain of the chase taking its toll on him. But his determination was clear. He was not about to let this suspect slip through his fingers again. We had reached the edge of the docks, where the ground was slick with rainwater and oil from the ships. The streetlights flickered intermittently, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch and twist like creatures of the fog. The scent of brine and rust filled the air, and the distant sound of the river lapping against the stone piers added to the eerie atmosphere. Holmes, his sharp mind never at rest, had already deduced the route our quarry was taking. "He is heading for the river," Holmes muttered under his breath, almost to himself. "He must have a boat, or at least a means to escape. We cannot allow him to get away." Lestrade's eyes narrowed as he quickened his pace. "Do you think he's armed, Holmes? If so, we may be in for more trouble than we anticipated." Holmes did not respond immediately, but instead focused on the path ahead. He was a man of action, and even now he was calculating every step with deliberate precision. We passed more darkened warehouses, some of which housed crates of goods that would be shipped across the globe, others abandoned, with windows shattered and doors left ajar. But it wasn't the warehouses that concerned us now. It was the man ahead, who was perhaps more dangerous than we could have imagined. As we approached a particularly dilapidated pier, Holmes held up his hand, signaling for us to stop. We all froze, listening intently. From ahead, we could hear the faint splashing of water. Someone was moving quickly, their footfalls muffled by the soft rhythm of the river. The figure ahead had stopped, perhaps realizing we were closing in on him. I could make out the shadow of a figure crouching near the edge of the pier, and then a flash of metal caught the dim light. A boat was tied to the post, small but fast. The man had been preparing for escape, and now it was a race to catch him before he could disappear into the Thames. "He's trying to get away by boat," I whispered, my breath forming visible clouds in the cold night air. "We must hurry." Holmes's face was a mask of intense concentration. He turned to Lestrade, his voice barely audible over the sound of the river. "Lestrade, you and Watson head to the far side of the dock. I will approach from this direction. We must trap him before he can set sail." Without waiting for a response, Holmes moved silently to the right, disappearing into the mist. Lestrade and I exchanged a brief glance before we took off toward the opposite end of the dock, our boots slipping on the slick stone as we moved. I could hear the steady thrum of Lestrade's breath, quick but controlled, as he matched my pace. We reached the far end of the dock, where a rickety wooden platform jutted out into the dark river. The water lapped against the posts, and the boat was now in full view, tethered tightly to a nearby post. The figure standing at the edge of the pier appeared to be distracted, fidgeting with something near the boat's bow. "Now!" Lestrade hissed. "It's our chance." We moved as swiftly as we could, knowing we had only seconds before the man would realize we were upon him. But just as we reached the edge of the dock, the man turned, his eyes widening in recognition. The instant his gaze met mine, he sprang into the boat, shoving the oars into the water with frantic desperation. "Stop!" I shouted, my voice carrying over the water. But the man didn't respond. Instead, he began to paddle frantically, his movements erratic as he tried to put distance between us. Holmes had anticipated this move. From the shadows to our left, I heard a sudden crack of wood, followed by the sound of a figure sprinting toward us. Holmes appeared at the last moment, and with a quick motion, he hurled a coil of rope toward Lestrade, who grabbed it and began to pull. "Holmes, what are you doing?" I called out, my eyes never leaving the fleeing man. "We cannot let him get away." "Indeed, Watson," Holmes responded coolly, his face grim but resolute. "But we must not allow our emotions to cloud our judgment. He will not escape." Holmes's calculations had proven accurate once again. Just as the man was gaining speed on the water, a sudden wave caused by a nearby ship's passage crashed against his boat. The man lost control of the oars, and for a brief moment, the boat veered off course, its stern slamming into a series of wooden posts. With a curse, the man struggled to regain his balance, and that's when Holmes seized the opportunity. Without hesitation, Holmes took aim with his pistol, and with a sharp crack, the boat's line snapped. The man, still trying to right his boat, was no match for Holmes's precise shot. He fell backward into the water, sinking into the murky depths of the river. Lestrade rushed to the edge of the dock, shouting down into the water, "He's gone! He's disappeared!" Holmes remained calm, holstering his pistol. "He's not dead, Lestrade. He simply made a calculated escape. But we know who he is now, and that will be enough." I could see the frustration in Lestrade's eyes as he looked down into the water, but Holmes was already thinking several steps ahead. The chase had been long, but the game was far from over. "We'll find him," Holmes continued, his voice steady as always, "and when we do, we will uncover the truth behind Pembroke's secrets. This is just the beginning." Chapter 12. The Silent Revelations. The fog on the river seemed to thicken with every passing moment, as though nature herself were conspiring to cloud the truth we sought to uncover. Standing on the edge of the dock, staring into the water where the man had vanished, I couldn't shake the feeling that this case was more complicated than we had originally imagined. Holmes stood motionless beside me, his eyes never leaving the water as he contemplated the next move. Lestrade, whose face had taken on a flushed, almost embarrassed hue, turned to us. "It was our only chance to catch him, Holmes. But now he's gone. Vanished. Do you think he drowned?" Holmes's voice was calm and measured, as if he had already moved beyond the possibility of failure. "No, Lestrade. He didn't drown. We would have seen signs of struggle or bubbles in the water, and the river's current would have carried him further downstream by now. What's more, this man is far too calculated to simply let himself be swept away by the tides." Lestrade stared at Holmes, his brow furrowing. "Then where has he gone?" Holmes took a deep breath, stepping away from the dock and turning back toward the warehouse district, his eyes scanning the shadows between the buildings. He spoke as he walked, his words heavy with meaning. "I have no doubt that he knew the docks better than we do. He's likely hidden himself in one of the many warehouses or alleyways that line this part of the city. The moment we made our presence known, he retreated, but not in panic, in strategic withdrawal." I quickened my pace to catch up with Holmes, who was already a few paces ahead. "Then, you believe the chase isn't over?" Holmes shot me a sharp glance. "Of course not, Watson. This man has more to hide than just his presence on the docks. His entire life has been a carefully orchestrated performance. Every move, every word, part of a grand design. He knows how to disappear in plain sight, and he will not simply give up." "But why the urgency?" I asked, my mind racing. "Why now? He could have easily disappeared at any time before this." Holmes stopped abruptly and turned to face me. "The man we are pursuing is not an ordinary criminal, Watson. He's someone far more dangerous, and his actions are not motivated by greed or revenge alone. There's something much bigger at stake here, something that involves the government itself." Lestrade stepped forward, his tone now a mixture of concern and frustration. "I don't understand, Holmes. All we have so far is a man who's clearly been involved in something illicit, but we're chasing shadows. Every lead we follow seems to bring us to another dead end." Holmes's eyes narrowed as he looked at Lestrade. "That's because we're not looking at this from the right angle. We've been following the wrong trail, Lestrade. This isn't a typical case of smuggling, nor is it simply a matter of personal revenge. What we are witnessing is something far more sinister, a conspiracy that involves those at the very top of our government. The weight of Holmes's words hung in the air like a dense fog. I felt a shiver run down my spine as the implications of his statements sank in. A government conspiracy? Could it be? And if so, what was the real secret that the mysterious man was trying to protect? I suggest we move quickly, Holmes continued, his voice quiet but filled with authority. The longer we delay, the more time our quarry has to cover his tracks. Lestrade nodded grimly. Where do we go from here? Holmes pointed toward the farthest end of the dock, where the faint outline of a large warehouse loomed against the misty horizon. That's where we'll begin, Lestrade. I have reason to believe that the man we're after is hiding in there. He may not be alone either. There could be more involved than we suspect. With no further words, we set off toward the warehouse, the fog swallowing our figures as we moved through the night. The eerie silence of the dock district was broken only by the soft creaking of the ships and the distant lapping of the water. The warehouse loomed before us, its dark, imposing structure seeming to hold its secrets behind every rusted door and shattered window. Holmes paused before the entrance and turned to face Lestrade and me. Wait here. I'll go in first. I can cover more ground and scout the area without being seen. You two stay out of sight, ready to act if necessary. Lestrade was about to protest, but Holmes had already melted into the shadows, his footsteps silent on the wet cobblestones. For a moment, I hesitated, my instincts telling me to follow him. But I knew better than to question Holmes's methods. He worked best alone in situations like these, his mind moving faster than any of us could keep up with. We'll stay put, Lestrade said, his tone tight. But if this turns into something more than we bargained for, we need to be ready. The minutes stretched into what felt like hours as we waited in silence, our breath visible in the chill night air. I could feel the tension in the air. Something was about to happen. I could sense it. And then, as if on cue, there was a faint rustling sound from within the warehouse. I looked at Lestrade, who was already signaling for me to stay still. His hand was on the revolver at his belt, but I could tell he was trying to remain calm. We didn't know what lay ahead, but one thing was certain. The game was reaching its climax. After a long moment of waiting, Holmes's figure appeared at the top of the warehouse steps, his face a mask of calm determination. He gave a brief nod, signaling that it was time to move. "Follow me," he said softly, his voice carrying no more than a whisper. "But stay close." We made our way up the stairs and through the creaky door, entering the dark interior of the warehouse. The air inside was thick with dust, and the faint smell of chemicals lingered in the stale air. I could hear the scurrying of rats in the corners, and the distant sounds of something, or someone, moving within the shadows. Holmes led the way, his movements precise and deliberate. We came to a row of crates stacked high in the darkness, and Holmes motioned for us to stop. "There's something in these crates," he whispered, his eyes gleaming with the thrill of discovery. "These aren't ordinary shipments. These contain something far more dangerous, something that could shake the very foundations of this country." The quiet realization was like a thunderclap in my mind. I couldn't begin to imagine what Holmes had uncovered in that moment, but one thing was certain. Whatever secrets lay hidden within the crates, they were not meant to be found. The conspiracy that Holmes had suspected was now becoming a chilling reality. Holmes turned to us, his voice low but urgent. "Stay close and be prepared for anything. We're about to uncover the truth, but we may not like what we find." The mystery was unfolding faster than we could process, and with each step we took, we were drawn deeper into a web of secrets that threatened to consume us all. Chapter 13, Unraveling the Web. The silence of the warehouse was oppressive, the air thick with the musty scent of aged timber and the pungent odors of chemicals we couldn't yet identify. My heart beat loudly in my chest, echoing in my ears, as Holmes motioned us to follow him deeper into the labyrinth of crates and shadows. The oppressive darkness of the warehouse seemed to grow heavier with each step, the cobwebs clinging to every corner, as if the very building had not been disturbed in years. I glanced over at Lestrade, whose hand hovered near his revolver, his eyes flicking nervously to every movement in the darkness. He was a seasoned detective, but even he could sense that something far more dangerous than simple crime was at play here. He nodded silently, as though ready for whatever might come next. Holmes, leading the way with his usual composed demeanor, had already stopped near one of the crates. His long fingers danced across the edges, searching for a hidden mechanism. He wasn't simply looking for a way to break into it. No, Holmes had an uncanny ability to sense when something was off even before it was obvious to the naked eye. The crate, nestled amongst others, seemed to hold a particular significance. "Watson," Holmes said quietly, "do you see this?" He pointed to a small but precise engraving on the side of the crate, a series of numbers, as though they had been carefully etched there by someone with a deep knowledge of codes. These markings are no mere decoration. They're part of the puzzle we've been trying to solve. I moved closer, squinting in the dim light. The numbers, though not immediately apparent to my untrained eye, were arranged in an order I had seen before, on the margins of some of the late diplomat's books. Could it be possible that these were part of the cipher we had been struggling to crack? I felt a ripple of unease run through me, as though I were standing on the precipice of something too vast and complicated to comprehend. Holmes continued to examine the crate with meticulous precision, his brow furrowed in concentration. "The numbers correspond to a code," he murmured. "It's the same one that was used in the diplomat's journals. If we can unlock this, Watson, we will be a step closer to uncovering the full extent of this conspiracy." Lestrade moved closer, his voice tinged with anxiety. "But what does it mean? Who would go to such lengths to hide this kind of information?" Holmes turned to face Lestrade, his eyes burning with a mixture of excitement and severity. "I suspect we are dealing with a faction far more influential than we ever imagined. This goes beyond a mere case of espionage or government secrets. There are lives at stake, lives that may have already been sacrificed to protect this knowledge." The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. Holmes had a way of making even the most mundane objects seem extraordinary. This crate, which could have easily been overlooked by anyone else, was suddenly the key to a mystery that threatened to unravel the very fabric of our society. Holmes's fingers found a hidden latch on the crate, and with a quiet click, the lid opened. I braced myself, unsure of what we would find inside. The faint glow of our lantern illuminated the contents, a series of large, sealed packets wrapped in brown paper. They appeared to be documents, though their shape was slightly off. They were too thick, too bulky for the average letter or report. Holmes's keen eyes scanned the contents quickly, his expression unreadable. "These are not just documents," he said, almost to himself. "These are plans, detailed instructions, complete with diagrams and maps. They are plans for an operation of immense scale." Lestrade leaned over, peering at the papers. "What kind of operation?" Holmes pointed to one of the diagrams, a map of London, marked with several key locations, some of which I recognized from our investigation, others that seemed utterly unfamiliar. "This," Holmes said, tapping the map, "is the city as it will look once the operation is complete. There are key points, government buildings, certain royal institutions that have been circled, but there is also something more. A series of locations marked in red, ones that appear to be related to shipping routes. This man wasn't just a spy or a thief. He was involved in something much more dangerous." I took a step back, my mind racing. "What could all this mean, Holmes? What kind of operation is this?" Holmes's eyes narrowed, the familiar glint of insight flickering in his gaze. "It's an old plan, Watson, one that has been in motion for decades. It involves a network of individuals who have infiltrated the highest levels of power in Britain, perhaps even beyond. What we are looking at is a vast conspiracy, one designed to change the course of history." Lestrade looked horrified. "You mean to say that this plot could go all the way to the monarchy itself?" Holmes nodded. "Precisely, Lestrade. The documents point to a scheme so carefully woven into the very infrastructure of Britain that most people would never know it existed. The people behind it have been biding their time, preparing for the right moment to strike." I looked at Holmes, my mind reeling from the magnitude of what we were facing. But who is behind all of this? Who has the power to orchestrate something of this scale? Holmes's gaze flicked to one of the final documents in the crate. He gingerly unfolded it, revealing a series of names, some familiar and others that seemed utterly foreign. As his eyes scanned the list, his face grew even more serious. "I was afraid of this," he said, his voice soft but heavy with the weight of his discovery. "The names on this list, they belong to individuals who are at the very heart of the British Empire. Men with influence, with power, men who can pull the strings behind the scenes without anyone ever suspecting a thing." I stepped closer, eager to see what had captured Holmes's attention so fully. The list was filled with names I had seen before: government officials, diplomats, military leaders. But there was one name that stood out like a beacon: Lord Edward Ashton. Lestrade's eyes widened when he saw it. "Lord Ashton? But he's one of the highest-ranking members of Parliament. He's known for his influence in foreign affairs." Holmes nodded gravely. "Exactly. Lord Ashton has been a key player in the scheme all along. His name appears in several places throughout these documents. But what's more troubling is the frequency with which he is mentioned in relation to the shipping routes. He's involved in more than just politics, Lestrade. He's deeply entangled in whatever this operation is." A chill ran down my spine as I processed this new revelation. Lord Ashton, a man who had always seemed so untouchable, so noble, was somehow connected to this conspiracy. But how? And why? Holmes replaced the documents in the crate, his mind already working furiously to piece together the puzzle. "We cannot afford to wait any longer," he said. "We must confront Lord Ashton before he has the chance to execute whatever plan he has set in motion. If we are right, and this operation is nearing its culmination, the consequences for Britain, and perhaps for the world, could be catastrophic." Lestrade's hand tightened on his revolver, a sense of urgency in his expression. "What do you need us to do, Holmes?" Holmes turned to face both of us, his eyes blazing with intensity. "We move quickly. We'll start by gathering more information on Ashton's activities, his connections. We need to act before he realizes we're onto him." The night had stretched on long enough, but our work was just beginning. Holmes's voice was resolute, his mind already racing ahead to the next steps. "Lestrade? Watson, this is no longer just a case. It's a race against time. If we fail now, it may be too late for everyone." And with that, we set our sights on Lord Edward Ashton, knowing that the final confrontation was looming ever closer. The web that had entangled the highest echelons of power was about to unravel, and with it, the dark secrets of a conspiracy that could shake the very foundations of the British Empire. Chapter 14. The Calm Before the Storm. The streets of London had always held an aura of unease at night, but this particular evening seemed to intensify the usual tension. The fog clung to the cobblestones, swirling in gusts that played tricks on the eyes. Holmes, Lestrade, and I stood in the shadows of a narrow alley, our breath visible in the crisp air. The city, though quiet, was teeming with an energy that none of us could ignore. It was as if something monumental was approaching, the calm before the storm. Holmes had already set a plan into motion, and we were no longer simply observing the ripples of a growing conspiracy. We had moved into a realm where each move, each moment mattered. Every hour brought us closer to the truth, and to Lord Edward Ashton, the man at the center of it all. "Holmes," I began, my voice low, "are we certain that Ashton is the one orchestrating everything? The documents we found pointed to him, but there is still so much that is unclear." Holmes adjusted the collar of his overcoat, his eyes scanning the street before he answered. "The truth, Watson, is rarely as simple as it appears, but Ashton's involvement is no coincidence. The names in those documents, his in particular, appear repeatedly, and the shipping routes he is tied to, they are far more than ordinary trade routes. They intersect with key points in our investigation. His presence is no longer incidental. It's pivotal." I nodded, though unease crept into my thoughts. I had long since learned that Holmes's conclusions were rarely wrong. However, the scale of what we were about to confront filled me with an ominous sense of dread. It was clear now that this was more than a matter of national security. It was a battle for the very integrity of the British government. Lestrade shifted his weight, clearly growing impatient. "Holmes, we've been chasing shadows for weeks now. What exactly is our next step? How do we get to Ashton before this operation is set into motion?" Holmes's gaze was unwavering. the fire of determination in his eyes sharp enough to cut through the fog. Our next step is one of patience, Lestrade. Ashton is aware that someone is closing in on him. We've made our presence known, but we must now wait for him to make the next move. It's a delicate balance. If we act too soon, we risk alerting him. If we wait too long, we may be too late. Lestrade grunted, clearly frustrated. So we're supposed to sit here and wait while this man plays his game? We've already lost too many leads. Every moment we waste, more damage is done. Patience, my friend, Holmes said calmly. Every piece of this puzzle is crucial. We know Ashton is preparing something, but we do not yet know the full scope. The documents were a key piece, but there are others we have yet to uncover. We must follow the thread carefully, as we would a delicate piece of lace. Pull too hard and it will break. I glanced at Holmes, wondering how he could maintain such calm in the face of this impending crisis. As usual, he seemed to be playing several moves ahead, his mind already weaving through possible scenarios even as we waited in the dark. The minutes seemed to stretch into hours, and the weight of the night hung heavy in the air. Lestrade muttered something under his breath, pacing back and forth, but Holmes remained motionless, his gaze fixed on the street beyond the alley. Suddenly, a figure appeared at the far end of the street, a tall, slender man whose gait was unmistakable. It was as if the fog parted for him, revealing his presence with a clarity that sent a shiver down my spine. Lord Edward Ashton. My breath caught in my throat as the man drew nearer. His usual air of aristocratic composure was slightly less assured tonight, but the power he exuded was undeniable. I couldn't help but notice the subtle, almost imperceptible bulge under his overcoat. A gun, perhaps, or a package of some sort. Holmes motioned for us to remain still, his finger to his lips. Ashton stopped outside a large townhouse, his eyes scanning the area with suspicion before he entered the building, the door closing softly behind him. "That's our target," Holmes murmured. "It seems he's ready to make his move." Lestrade's hand was already on his revolver, but Holmes quickly shook his head. "Not yet, Lestrade. We cannot confront him directly. We must first understand the purpose of this meeting and the role it plays in his plan." I raised an eyebrow, the same unease I had been feeling earlier tightening in my chest. "And what is it that you propose we do, Holmes?" Holmes's face was unreadable as he thought for a moment. "We wait. We must see who enters that house and what they bring with them. Ashton is involved in something much larger than we've yet realized. To strike too soon would spoil our chances. We must understand the full operation before we act." We huddled in the darkness, the minutes dragging on like hours. My mind raced, the pieces of the puzzle clicking into place. Ashton had always seemed like a man of integrity, a respected member of Parliament, a man who held sway over many of Britain's most powerful institutions. But now, as I watched him disappear into that townhouse, I saw him in a new light. He wasn't merely a politician. He was something far more dangerous. Eventually, the door to the townhouse opened again, and a figure emerged. It was a man dressed in a dark cloak, carrying a bundle wrapped in brown paper. He approached Ashton with a brisk, purposeful stride, and the two men exchanged a few brief words. The bundle was handed off, and Ashton disappeared back into the house. "Do you see that?" Holmes's voice was quiet but intense. "That bundle, it's no ordinary package. Whatever it contains, it's part of whatever scheme Ashton is orchestrating." Lestrade gripped his revolver with determination. "So now what? We rush in and confront him?" Holmes shook his head. "No, Lestrade. We need that bundle. That is the key to understanding the full scope of this operation. We will follow him, retrieve it, and uncover the final piece of the puzzle. Only then will we have the leverage we need to bring Ashton to justice." The fog seemed to grow thicker around us, as if the very air conspired to hide our movements. We followed Ashton at a careful distance, making sure not to alert him to our presence. The darkness offered us some protection, but the tension in the air was palpable. It felt as though every footstep, every breath we took, might tip the balance in our favor, or bring disaster upon us. At last, we arrived at a small, inconspicuous building tucked away in a side street. Ashton entered, the door closing behind him with a soft thud. Holmes motioned for us to remain outside. "We wait here," he said softly. "This is where the final piece of the puzzle will fall into place." And so we stood in the shadows, waiting for the storm to break, knowing that the end of this tangled web was nearly within reach. Chapter 15, The Final Confrontation. The evening's fog had settled thicker now, shrouding the narrow street in an oppressive haze. The fog seemed to carry the weight of the tension that had grown since we first began tracking Lord Edward Ashton. It was as if London herself was holding her breath, waiting for what was to come. Holmes stood in the shadows, his posture stiff with concentration, his eyes unwavering as he watched the door of the building where Ashton had disappeared. Lestrade, pacing restlessly a few feet away, muttered under his breath, his impatience growing with each passing moment. "Holmes, this waiting is maddening. We've been at it for hours now. Why don't we just rush in and—" "No, Lestrade," Holmes interrupted firmly, his voice low but commanding. "Rushing in would be foolish. We need to be patient. Ashton is already suspicious of our presence. One misstep and we risk losing everything. The bundle he carries holds the final piece of this puzzle. We must be careful." Lestrade grumbled but knew better than to argue further. Holmes's judgment had never failed us yet, though the slow burn of anxiety that had been building in me was threatening to consume my nerves. I glanced at Holmes, his figure silhouetted against the streetlights. "What do you think, Holmes?" I asked quietly. "What is he planning with this package?" Holmes's face was still, a mask of calm, but his eyes burned with an intensity that spoke volumes. "The answer lies within that bundle, Watson. I believe it is the key to unveiling the full scope of his operation, what he's been hiding all these years, his ties to Her Majesty's government, the letters he's been blackmailing politicians with, the men he's been dealing with in the shadows. The bundle he carries could contain evidence of something far larger than a mere forgery or financial scandal." Lestrade's voice was sharp with frustration. "And what exactly do we do when we finally get our hands on this evidence?" Holmes turned slightly, his gaze never leaving the building. "We confront him directly. We confront him with his crimes, his manipulation of the highest levels of government, his attempt to cover up the deepest secrets of the empire." A shiver ran down my spine as the weight of Holmes's words settled upon me. We were not simply chasing a forgery or a case of blackmail. Ashton was a part of something far darker, something that could shake the foundations of the government itself. Suddenly, the door to the building creaked open, and we all froze, our attention locked on the figure that emerged. Lord Ashton himself stepped into the mist, his eyes scanning the street with a sharp, calculating look. He adjusted the collar of his coat, and for a moment, it seemed as though he had sensed something, as if he could feel the invisible web closing around him. But then, with an almost imperceptible sigh, he turned and began walking briskly down the street, the bundle clutched tightly under his arm. "He's leaving," Lestrade hissed. "What now?" Holmes's eyes gleamed. "Now we follow." We moved in silence, shadows blending into the mist as we tailed Ashton through the maze of streets. My heart beat faster with each step, the tension rising. Ashton, for all his composure, had been playing a dangerous game, and now it seemed he was preparing to make his final move. What did he plan to do with the documents in that bundle? And why was he acting so strangely? His usual arrogance seemed to have been replaced by something far more cautious, almost fearful. We kept our distance, allowing him to lead us through the labyrinthine streets of the city. At last, he stopped outside a stately building that seemed out of place in the middle of the poorer part of town. It was an imposing structure, its tall stone facade towering over the surrounding buildings. A private residence, perhaps. But it was what lay behind the structure that caught Holmes's attention. "There," Holmes whispered, pointing discreetly to a smaller door at the side of the building. It was poorly lit, almost hidden in the shadows of the alley. "That's the entrance to his true operation." Lestrade squinted, his hand hovering near the gun holstered at his side. "So, that's where we make our move?" Holmes's lips curled into a thin smile. "Not yet. We need to gather more evidence. We must see who he meets with and what they do inside. If we confront him prematurely, we risk him destroying everything." With bated breath, we waited in the alley across the street, hidden in the shadows, our eyes fixed on the building. For what seemed like an eternity, nothing moved. But then at last, the door creaked open again. This time, it wasn't Ashton who emerged, but a man in a dark suit, his face hidden by a wide-brimmed hat. He walked briskly across the street, heading in our direction. "Who is this?" I whispered, straining my eyes. Holmes was already watching intently, his sharp gaze noting the man's movements. "Someone significant, Watson. I suspect he is one of Ashton's allies, a man involved in the web of deceit he's been weaving." The man passed by us, unaware of our presence. He approached a carriage waiting at the far end of the alley and climbed inside. The carriage rattled away, its destination unknown. Holmes's eyes narrowed. "Lestrade, do you have the men ready?" Lestrade gave a curt nod. "They're waiting for your signal." Holmes took a deep breath, then turned to face us. "It's time. We move now." We crept towards the entrance of the building, our footsteps muffled by the thick fog. Lestrade positioned himself at the rear, while Holmes and I approached the front. The door was unlocked, though I couldn't help but feel the sense of finality that came with every step closer to the truth. Holmes's hand was steady as he pushed the door open, and we entered the darkened hallway. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of something chemical, something that was both foreign and unsettling. It was the smell of secrecy, of conspiracies waiting to be uncovered. A soft click echoed through the silence as a light flickered in the distance. A figure appeared, stepping out of the shadows, Lord Ashton himself, looking more strained than I had ever seen him. His eyes locked onto Holmes's, and for a moment, the world seemed to pause. "You've come too late, Mr. Holmes," Ashton said, his voice cold, though there was a tremor of unease beneath it. "This game is over. You've no idea what you're dealing with." Holmes stepped forward, his presence commanding. "The game is only over when the truth is revealed, Ashton. You've manipulated the highest levels of government, blackmailed countless individuals, and buried a scandal that threatens the very integrity of the empire. But it ends tonight." Ashton's lip curled into a smile, but it was devoid of humor. "You think you can stop me? You think you understand the power I hold?" He pulled the bundle from under his coat, revealing a stack of papers wrapped in plain brown paper. "This," he said, holding the bundle aloft, "is the key to everything. With it, I can bring down every man you've ever trusted. Every official, every politician, every high-ranking officer who thinks they're safe from my reach." Holmes's eyes gleamed. "I don't think so, Ashton, because we have you, and your operation is finished." A tense silence fell between us, the weight of the moment hanging in the air. Then, suddenly, the sound of heavy footsteps echoed down the hallway, and the door at the far end of the room flew open. Several men entered, armed and ready to fight. But Holmes, ever prepared, had anticipated this. A fierce scuffle broke out, but Lestrade and his men swiftly restrained the intruders, subduing them with practiced ease. Ashton, however, stood frozen, his eyes wide with shock and fury. He dropped the bundle, his plans unraveling before his eyes. "You've lost," Holmes said softly, his voice cold but final. "The truth always comes to light in the end." Ashton's face twisted with rage and defeat. "You may have stopped me now, Holmes," he spat, "but there are others. There are always others." Holmes stepped forward, his gaze unwavering. "Perhaps, but for now, you're finished. Your secrets will no longer remain hidden." The evidence had been secured, and with it, the full extent of Ashton's criminal enterprise was revealed. The scandal was enough to shake the very foundations of the British government, implicating high-ranking officials in a vast web of corruption, espionage, and blackmail. Ashton's downfall was swift and complete, and his allies soon found themselves arrested as well. As we left the building, the fog had begun to lift, and the first light of dawn began to break through the mist. The city of London, so often shrouded in darkness, now seemed to awaken to a new day. Holmes stood silently for a moment, watching the sun rise over the city. "Another case concluded," he said softly, almost to himself. "Another web unraveled." I looked at him, the weight of the case settling in. "What will happen to Ashton?" Holmes turned to me, his eyes as sharp as ever. "He will stand trial, Watson, and the truth will be revealed. But even so, there will always be others like him, others who seek to manipulate power for their own gain." I nodded, understanding the bitter truth of his words. But for now, at least, one dangerous game had come to an end. Epilogue. Lord Edward Ashton was sentenced to life imprisonment. His vast network of corruption unraveled piece by piece. The documents recovered from his operation were made public, exposing an intricate web of betrayal within the highest echelons of power. The scandal shook the foundations of the British government, but it also served as a stark reminder that even the most carefully constructed secrets cannot remain hidden forever. For Holmes and I, the case was yet another victory. But even as we moved on to other matters, I knew that the shadow of men like Ashton would always loom over the empire. It was a fight that could never truly end, Ian. Thank you so much for listening. We hope you enjoyed the story. Don't forget to leave a comment letting us know which story you'd like to hear next and where you're tuning in from. We love hearing from our detective fans around the world. See you in the next adventure.